Corey, you go first. I like to see
Recorded live from what's left of our Patreon audience. It's Coffee Talk.
1, 2, 3. You're live.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first introduction of today's Coffee Talk. There was definitely not an introduction before this that Stefan edited out because it made him look bad. There definitely was not.
It's Coffee Talk with ADIKA. Nothing rhymes with that but chicken tikka. We name drop here with Stefan and all his friends.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It is Coffee Talk, ADIKA Live. Thank you for tuning in. And for everybody new that's out there, we are a talk show, so celebrities, human interest stories, all that good stuff, banter, comedy, and sometimes if it gets a little too real, you might want to check out. So, hey, disclaimer always, but there's that little button right below, beautiful Miranda. So all you got to do is subscribe, hit that bell to remind yourself when we are on to entertain you. Corey, Miranda, welcome. Good morning. We have an incredible show. You guys remember Jonestown? It was big. It was a big story.
In our lexicon, don't drink the Kool-Aid. We'll have that for another 50 years because of this. People will be saying that without even knowing why they're saying it. Because of Jonestown.
It might have happened before I was born, so even I knew about Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, and I knew it was called Jonestown, and so that's how prevalent and effective. And it's been 40 years since this has gone on?
There's a couple of things you always remember. You remember where you were, you know, when certain things happen in your life. I remember when Lennon was assassinated. Exactly. I remember when the Jonestown Massacre happened. I remember exactly where I was. In Brooklyn, watching the news and seeing the image of just this it looked like a village to me. I didn't understand it because here I am sitting. I'm like, what is this? And I couldn't. It was just an awful disaster happening. Today we have a strong survivor from Jonestown coming on here, and her story is incredible. Being a strong woman at 20 years old with her 1-year-old child escaping Jonestown, escaping there. So I want everybody to welcome right now on the screen, Yulanda Williams. Yolanda, welcome to Coffee Talk ADIKA. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you're very welcome. Yolanda, that's Corey, and that's Miranda,
Hi.
our co-host.
Hi.
So, and we have a couple of people in the audience that will probably maybe put some questions, and we'll pop them up here and all that.
Okay.
Because you look like a chief right here. So I just tell you.
Lieutenant.
Okay. Lieutenant. Okay,
well, right
so
now
correct
I'm serving
me.
as lieutenant. Prior to going off on a medical leave, I was the acting captain for the San Francisco Police Department. I am a 30-plus year veteran of SFPD first generation.
Fantastic.
And I am a survivor from Jonestown, which this year will be 43 years, and it's been 44 years since I've been in Jonestown.
44 years, correct?
Yes.
Let's go back, Yolanda, as a little girl, if we can go back then, and your family.
How did you get to Jonestown?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was raised in a Christian home. My father was a Baptist minister, and so our routine was every Sunday we would definitely be at church, and generally that was an all-day situation, and then sometimes we would go to church during the midweek. And at approximately the age of 11, my father had sustained a heart condition, and his doctor had taken him off of work and told him that he would probably never be able to go back to work again because the muscles and arteries around his heart were severely damaged. So at that point, you know, my life was changing because the life I had known was more middle class, and then to suddenly realize that your dad may no longer be able to work, and then try to figure out what life is going to look like with such a drastic change occurring in a household. So my father had gone out for the day, and he ran into one of his clergy friends who had been told about my dad's condition And he had told my dad that there was a prophet, believe it or not, that was in a little place called Redwood Valley up in Northern California, and that this prophet was able to heal people, and he also could tell you things about your life that no one else could potentially have known. And so he suggested to my dad that he not give up on his faith and his belief in the power of God, and that he come to People's Temple in Redwood Valley and meet this man. And of course, he said his name is Reverend Jim Jones, but we just call him plain old Jim. So my dad, of course, came home later that day and was telling my mother about this. And so I guess within a week or two of him having heard about Jim Jones and People's Temple, my mother and my father went up to Redwood Valley to see for themselves. And when they came back, the things that they told me were extremely impressive because they told me that it was a multiracial church, and that the minister was not like a traditional Baptist minister that we were accustomed to being around, but he was just a regular plain old guy who wore, a shirt, some black pants, black shoes, and he was just very, very charismatic and loving and caring. And then they told me about the number of young people who were involved in People's Temple, and they told me that they had a pool inside of the church. They owned this land with acres of grapevines, and there was all this livestock and everything around there. So for me, being a city girl, I wasn't accustomed to anything like that. So immediately it piqued my curiosity and interest. And so I'd say within less than a month of them having made that first trip to People's Temple, I was excited about going, and we got up early, early in the morning. I'd say probably about 5:30 or 6 in the morning because it was a 2.5 hour drive. But we did make our way to Redwood Valley, and then I finally had my first encounter and acquaintance with People's Temple, their members, and of course, Jim Jones and his family. And needless to say, it was quite an experience, extremely unusual because, again, as I said, it was a multiracial church.
Hmm.
What was really unusual was seeing a swimming pool in a church, and then after church is over, having the minister tell you you can eat your food. They've got free food for you to eat, and then after you eat, you can go and swim or either just walk around the property and just enjoy, you know, the fruit, or engage in conversations with folks that you just never knew.
Mm.
So it was a very inviting environment and a very enticing environment because Jim had a way of communicating with people, and it could be a mass of people, but you would always think he was speaking specifically to you because he always had this ability or this discernment to be able to figure out what motivated you more so than anything else in life. And he would tap into that and find something that was relevant to you, that made you feel important, made you feel needed, and made you feel like he was the source and the answers to everything that you were experiencing in life.
Yolanda, before the other, when you would go to church, what was the, I guess, the environment like for a regular church that this one stood? You have the swimming pools here, the bells and whistles. It's almost like the Cadillac of churches. A regular church, what was it like as a kid? A regular church compared.
As a kid, it was totally exciting for me because, like I said, yeah, there's a pool there. But what was even more exciting was seeing a choir. There was a children's choir, and I mean, it was massive. There were so many young children in there. And then they had what was like the um, young adults choir. And again, that was massive and it was interracial. The songs were songs that you would not normally hear in a church, like Come and Sing a Simple Song of Freedom. Um, and then as time progressed on, we started to hear songs that we were familiar with, like Don't You Know God is Able? And it was, even though it was interdenominational,
Hmm.
there was still a religious focal point. And so that's what really kept us engaged, because he would speak about some things in the Bible, but as time progressed, he started more and more to find errors in the Bible or things that he felt were incorrect in the Bible. Like, for example, telling us, why would a Bible tell you slaves obey your masters? Does that make any sense? And then he would go on and just find other things that were conflicting, like women keep silent in the church. So naturally, if you were a woman and you thought that you should be empowered, that would then get you kind of upset with the writings that was in the Bible. Ultimately, he told us that the King James version of the Bible, which we use in the Baptist churches, which is what my background is Baptist, um, that King James was a drunken slave master, and he actually owned one of the first slave ships. And why would we believe anything that he's written? Don't we recognize that this was just a way for him to control slaves? And if you look back at slave
Hmm.
movies, you will see that the Bible was always used in order to keep the servants and the slaves under control. So he started to kind of like take away that which was most important to us as Black people, because as Black people, we're very faithful people.
Hmm.
We're very loyal to the one whom we look to as our shepherd. And at this point, Jim Jones had become our shepherd.
Hmm.
So we would not necessarily question him. We would research things sometimes. And if there was some type of doubt, we would err on the side that maybe it was just our lack of understanding as to what he had said. And so as time progressed, you become more attuned to the type of teachings that he's giving to you. And it went from just being a church to more of a movement involving politics. Of course, there was the Drug Rehabilitation Center. There was a legal defense team for people if you had family members that were having problems with the law. They would have attorneys available free of charge. Church members would go to court hearings and make sure that they wrote letters. There was a letter writing committee. They would write letters to the judges, to the congressmen, senators. They didn't care. They were writing letters all the time. So this was like a movement, and it was a mechanism and a machine that was well refined and extremely organized, to the point that you became so dependent upon this church and its philosophies, its beliefs, and its morals, that when you weren't there, you felt guilty. And he also made you, of course, feel guilty.
Mm.
And and you all of a sudden no longer begin to even think for yourself. You would let him think for you. You would let him tell you what you needed. And because you felt he was going to supply all of your needs. And in
So,
fact, with my marriage, they he had to approve my marriage, and
Really?
I we went along with that. Yes.
so Yolanda, Jim Jones was, in your estimation, always like a bad dude, never like a good guy that that went bad or just had a bad week or something like that. He zeroed in on the Black community, exploited their weaknesses, and told you guys what you wanted to hear.
Yes, initially he told us what we wanted to hear. It was a slow, subliminal message. And then slowly he began to turn it to what he wanted it to be. And then it became a form of a brainwashing technique. And then the threats of, if you try to leave, excommunication, or possibly being harmed, or someone else in your family potentially being harmed.
That's the
So
genius
at
of
one point, uh,
oh, sorry,
go
that's
ahead.
the genius of all cults and regimes is the fact that they base their interactions with you on something that is true and actually good and resonates, and that's how we begin to talk to people when we're trying to recruit them. That's the way I took a terrorism class in college after 9/11, and that's the exact same way they were able to find people who had weaknesses that they saw in a societal way, and they were able to cultivate a sense of belonging. And
Right.
it's amazing to me that this continues to happen generation after generation in different formats. But it's because everything on the outset sounds like, wow, it sounds like a really nice place, but then there's that shift
Well,
where
you look back.
control.
Okay, so what
Yeah.
when the massacre happened, it was 44 years ago. And if you look at time, then you look at somebody like Hitler, for example. Look what he was doing, and his mind and manipulating.
He
You know,
convinced a lot of people to do a
Yeah.
lot of really terrible things.
you
Well,
know.
now remember now the massacre is 43 years ago. I'm like 44 years since I've been in Jonestown. But
Hmm.
the thing that's very interesting is you bring up a good point about Hitler.
Hmm.
Now, bear in mind when Jim Jones first starts, he starts off as a friend, just plain old simple Jim, a
Hmm.
good guy who's willing to give his last dime, his penny. He would turn the bottom of his sole of his shoes up, and you'd see holes in it, and he'd have cardboard in there, trying to prove to you that he was making as many sacrifices as he could for humanity.
Hmm.
Okay, so after he does that, he then becomes more sinister, and things start to change. Ultimately, before we went to Jonestown, there was constant talk as though he was intrigued by people like Hitler, Stalin, uh, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, uh, the Jewish concentration camps, constantly showing us the Night and Fog movie almost every Sunday. And when church would be over, we'd have like I'd say it was like intermission where you go and eat and then you get ready to go back to night service. Because his whole thing was keep you in church, keep you away from your biological family who are not members so that you don't have time to think for yourself. You're indoctrinated into hearing his voice and needing to hear his voice to give you that sense of security. Okay. And so in the movie Night and Fog, he constantly explained to us about the fact of look how the Jewish people are being killed. They're going in to take a shower and then they're being gassed. What are they doing with their skin? They're using their skins to make lampshades. What are they doing with this body part, that body part? And he just went on and on and
Wow.
on. And to the point that I began to question why he was making us see the movie so much, but he would always rationalize irrational behavior to the point that he was such a genius about it. He just kind of let it slide. He said, "Oh, okay, he wants us to make sure that we know this information." And then the final thing to put the ultimate fear in those of us who were black and brown in his church is he told us that the CIA and the FBI did not want us to be successful here in the United States because they did not really want to see uh, a multiracial organization. So he was going to take us to another place, which of course he called the Promised Land, for the perfect utopia. And it was also being established because he was trying to save black people from being harmed by this government. He told us that the projects and all of these low income facilities were one day going to be surrounded by cyclone fencing, and there would be the National Guards and military people walking around, and we would more or less be interned, just like what happened to the Japanese people. But they were going to be planning this for Black people. So we needed to come with him, we needed to follow him because he knew the way, and he was the leader for the future. And if we wanted to have a bright future that was free from violence, free from racism, free from sexism, etc. We would want to be in People's Temple and definitely move to Georgetown, Guyana, and specifically live in Jonestown communally so we wouldn't have to pay rent or anything and we would all have our own homes.
Sounds very
Wow.
much like Manson to me. I mean,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that was another person that he also focused on was Charles Manson and Squeaky Fromm and all of them. He said, look what they did for their leader. And he didn't do that much for them. He didn't do as much for them as I do for you. The sacrifices I make for you are far greater than any sacrifice that they would be willing to make.
Wow.
So, Lieutenant Williams, when did you have an aha moment? Because I'm just, what happened?
Well, I was a late bloomer, I say, because what he did with me was he kept giving me areas of responsibility. So it didn't really give me a lot of time to think on my own. Because you have to realize in cults, you have to, your individuality has to be removed and
Mm-hmm.
you become part of the one body, one mind. So I did not have my eyes awakened until I actually got over there to Georgetown. And the epiphany occurred when we got off the plane and we were waiting for our luggage. And when our luggage was going through customs, I saw these large, large crates. And I said, that's not our stuff. And then suddenly the person who was coming to pick us up from People's Temple said, shh, shh, be quiet. Those are things for the agricultural project that we need. And we're just letting it come through like it's your stuff so that we don't have to pay extra for customs. So I didn't say that. I just said, okay, fine. So once we got into the van and we went to the home that they had purchased on Lamaha Gardens, which was in the state capital in Georgetown, Guyana, it was then that I totally realized that a grave mistake had been made because when they opened up the crates, I saw big rifles come out of it. At the time, I didn't know what, I just said they were guns, but I now realize that they were rifles, all types of rifles and ammunition, things that, of course, me nor my husband had put in any crates of any kind. And then they suddenly asked us to give them our passports. They stripped us of our passports. They asked us if we had any US dollars. Fortunately, we both were smart enough to say we didn't have that. And they argued with my then husband, who was an attorney, for like over 15 to 20 minutes before they could convince him to just give over the passport. Because finally, I just told him, just give them the passports because I don't want to go through this any longer. I'm tired of arguing with these people.
well, how did it go from that to your escaping? It sounds like you didn't escape.
Well, what happened was after we had stayed at least 2 weeks there, he told me he wanted me and my husband and my daughter to go to see Jonestown. So after a long trip to Jonestown, when I saw Jonestown, I was in shock because first of all, we had to fly in on a little bitty plane, and then it was at least a 5 mile ride on a dirt truck. And remember, I'm a city girl, so I'm not used to all this stuff. And then when you get to the entrance, seeing people that I knew that were at one point in time his security, now armed with big rifles and then this big sign that says, Welcome to Jonestown Agricultural Project. And then when you go into the actual encampment to see what they considered homes, I wouldn't have considered that any such thing. If anything, to me, it was like just dilapidated, quickly constructed buildings that, as far as I'm concerned, were not really fit for what I would say was a home. There were no real beds. It was just plywood and built together, and then they were in stacks of three tiers. So instead of being a bunk bed, it would be a triple bed. And they had the women's dormitory and the men's dormitory. So he lied to us about having our own individual houses. When you went to take a shower, It was a big, big room, of course, with you never saw sheetrock. Everything was just made out of wood. So here we had plywood, and instead of having shower heads for the showers, it was just water coming through the pipe. And immediately it triggered a thought for me about night and fog. I said, "Oh my God, this man could gas us in here." And then hearing him rambling on the PA system 24/7. And when it wasn't his live voice, it was old tapes. So then I started to realize
Mm.
this man is trying to drive us crazy because we would have to get up at like about 5 or 5:30 in the morning, and then we wouldn't be able to go to sleep until about 11:30 or 12 at night. Totally sleep deprived. And then meat never seen. Only one time when there was a guest and he was trying to impress them. But other than that, there was no meat. Primary diet was rice. But for me, I found because I spent a lot of time in Georgetown, I survived and my daughter survived off of peanut butter because peanut butter was plentiful there, bread, and coconuts because coconuts were plentiful. But as far as having like milk and eggs, things like that, never.
Nothing, huh? Well, let me ask you,
No.
Yolanda.
Mhm.
You said when guests would come there, what are celebrity guests, politicians? What kind of guests
No.
would come? What?
just just people from the Guyanese government or something, and he'd be trying to impress them. So he'd make a big fanfare. But
Mhm.
by far and large, people were not only mentally deprived, but nutrition wise, they were deprived. And because the food was being made all in one big kitchen, to this day, I suspect that there may have even been something being placed in the food. I'm just not certain.
Mhm. Mhm.
How did you get out of there?
It's coffee talk with the Tika. Nothing rhymes with that but chicken tikka. We name drop here. With Stephen and all his friends.
And remember, everybody, click up there, click down there, click over there, click over here, and share it, and give somebody a hug today. We love you. Mwah. Big mazel.